This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. I'm really excited to share with you my interview with Deb Dana. She is an expert on the practical application of the polyvagal theory. What's going on in our nervous system and how can we regulate ourselves? In this interview, she talks about co-regulating, she talks about parenting, how to work with ourselves and other people, how we self-regulate for protection if we don't have reliable, regulated adults around us when we're children. This will explain a lot of what happens in life and how we can feel safe enough to really fall in love with life and enjoy ourselves. I know you'll enjoy this interview too. Well, thank you, Deb. This is Deb Dana here for the Radical Recovery Summit. And I'm so delighted that we get a chance to talk and that we get a chance to explore the nervous system a little bit. I'm such a follower and a fan of your work to really go deeply into this. So maybe we could start with just a little bit about how you got interested in this. I know you're a social worker and IFS and all of that. How did it land in polyvagal theory?
I'm a social worker, and I have always been sort of a neuroscience nerd in my work. I have been fascinated by the brain, and one of my favorite experiences was gathering a group of fellow social workers and the ability to go into the histology lab at our local university medical school and actually work with human brains and section them and see them. It was so fascinating to me because I think, at that point I thought, well, this is what I'm impacting when I'm doing my clinical work. I'm impacting this amazing organ inside my client's brain. And then I read Steve's first book, The Polyvagal Theory, and it was like a missing piece of a puzzle fell into place, something I hadn't known I'd been missing. And then it was like, oh, here's actually where I am making my connection is through the nervous system. It's through that subcortical process of coming into connection and attunement and all the things we talk about in the clinical world. But here was an explanation of, oh, here's how it works. And so I became a polyvagal passionate clinician and reached out to Steve and he's a delightful human being, very, very generous in his offering to mentor and be with, and began creating a clinical application because it's a beautiful, elegant theory. And what do we do with it? Right? It's lovely for me to understand it, but how do I bring it into my clients' lives? Because my belief is that we should all be active operators of our own nervous systems. And so that became my quest to figure out, what do I do with this to make it easily understandable to anybody? And in the beginning, I drove my colleagues crazy because I kept trying out things with them, and they were very kind as well. It's like, oh, here she comes again. So it was lovely, though, to have these colleagues and friends who would be my test pilots and say, oh, this one does not work at all. And, oh, this one, yeah, I like this one. So that's where we've ended up with some practical ways to bring polyvagal alive in our clinical work. Yeah.
Mm. So, for people who don't have much of a sense of how it works, do you want to just kind of outline the basics of it?
Sure. And I stick with three basic organizing principles: neuroception, hierarchy, and co-regulation. And I know those are new words to people as well. And my, hope is that after we finished our conversation, they'll become easily understandable words and words that people begin to use. So neuroception is really the way the nervous system takes in information. So, when you and I are just getting to know each other, our nervous systems are getting cues from our faces, from the energy, from, the way we're moving. And that's done through neuroception. And so neuroception is a way the nervous system listens in three pathways: inside, outside, and between. So it's listening inside our bodies, micro moment to see what feels safe and what feels unsafe. It listens in the environment. You and I were talking earlier about the environments we're in at the moment, and I have a lot of traffic noise out my window, which is a neuroception of danger as I'm trying to record with you, right? But so it listens in the environment for those cues. And then it listens between, which is what our nervous systems are doing, listening in between the relational space, does this person feel safe enough to approach, to engage with? Or are there, does it feel a bit unsafe? And do I want to, maybe not approach or even move away? So that's neuroception. And I do want to give Steve credit for creating that word. There was not a word to describe how the nervous system does this information gathering, because perception involves the cortex. That's the thinking part of your brain that perceives. So he came up with neuroception. I love the word neuro for neural, inception for awareness. And I think it should be a household word now, neuroception. We begin to talk about, we're neurocepting, or it's neuroceptive, and, all the ways that a word comes to life. So that's the first organizing principle. And I think the one that drives the rest, because as neuroception takes in cues of safety or unsafety, we then move to the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is Steve's brilliant description of how the three states of the nervous system work together. When he created polyvagal theory, when he developed it, he was really, bringing back into awareness and reimagining the way we have three states, and they work in a specific order, which for we humans and, for we clinicians is a lovely thing to know, because I can know, where I am, where I'm going, and how to get back to regulation because of this predictable order. So at the top of the hierarchy is what's called ventral vagal. And it's a system of regulation, connection, organization, right? It's where I feel okay enough, safe enough, connected enough to meet my day in a way that feels successful enough, right? And it's not everything's not wonderful, grand, blissful. It can be, but doesn't have to be in this place. It's I'm okay. That's what my clients would tell me all the time in ventral. I'm okay. Right? That's beautiful. I'm okay. Okay enough. So that's the ventral biological place where those emergent qualities are there for us. And in that place, we have 4 pathways of connection. We connect to self, to others, to the world, and spirit. Those pathways are open to us when we're in that biological place of regulation. When the world gets to be a little too much of a challenge for us, and I think we could all remember a time recently when that happened. I know there have been many times for me recently it felt a little overwhelming, and our nervous system very brilliantly moves from ventral down one step on the hierarchy to the sympathetic nervous system, where it brings us the energy needed to mobilize to meet the moment, right? That's typically thought of as fight and flight. It's a survival energy. Right. And so that survival energy comes to rescue us from the overwhelm of the world. If that doesn't manage the situation in a way that feels safe enough that we can return to ventral, then we often go to that bottom state on the hierarchy, the dorsal vagal experience. And that's a survival energy that drains us of all energy. We collapse. We're shut down. In its nuanced flavor, it's that sense of going through the motions but not having the energy to really care or really be present doing it. In its extreme flavor, it's a full collapse where I'm in a fetal position under the covers, can't move, or dissociated. But there are lots of flavors of that. So that's hierarchy. So at the moment I'm loving being anchored in ventral here with you. And if something came in and disrupted us, we'd move to sympathetic and then come back, I imagine. Something too much, if it's ongoing and we feel trapped and can't escape, we often go to that dorsal place. It's the rescue from everything. We sort of disappear in that place. So that's hierarchy. And then we get to co-regulation, which is, I always put it third. It maybe should come first, but it's the third organizing principle that I talk about, co-regulation. Because our nervous systems, need to be in connection with other nervous systems in order to experience both physical and psychological well-being. If we think about co-regulation, it's co-regulating with safe others. So in the language we just talked about, it's co-regulating with other nervous systems that can find the way to ventral regulation and offer those cues of safety to our nervous system through neuroception. So co-regulation is what we're all looking for. And boy, hasn't that been a challenge over the past 18 months, right? To be with others in a way that the nervous system feels connected. Co-regulation has been really challenging. And we know that for many of us, people have been dangerous may continue to be dangerous in our lives. So co-regulation becomes a paradoxical challenge, because I need it and yet it feels dangerous. And so I reach out. I have a longing to be in connection. I have a biological need to be in connection, but my survival energy says not safe. And that's the challenge we face a lot, right? That how do I reach out when it feels so unsafe? Yeah. Mm.
With COVID too, like so many situations, there is a danger other people could be carrying a virus that could kill us. And so
Yes.
our nervous system knows that even though we want connection, there's something quite a lot safer about being on a Zoom connection than being in an in-person one right now because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And it's been interesting to watch the world try and manage that, right? We see the sympathetically charged survival energy with the people that I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm going to be with other people. That's a biological need that's happening and is being expressed in this way. Or we see the people who begin to isolate and don't even Zoom, right? Begin to really close down, and that's that dorsal survival energy that everything feels so unsafe. I can't, so I'm just going to collapse, right? And we've seen that a lot in the world. We see that those two groups really suffering, right? And it's only from ventral when I can feel regulated enough that I can make some informed decisions, that we can, reach out and connect in a way that is safe, or we can, sort of have these conversations that need to happen. They can't happen unless we have an anchor in ventral.
So I wonder if we could come back to childhood development a little bit around co-regulation. And so if someone has intergenerational trauma or anything, any reason why their parents are not able to co-regulate with them, then what happens in the child's system then?
Yeah. It's so common for so many people. We come into the world with this biological expectation that we'll be met by a regulated human, right? And for so many of us, that doesn't happen, right? And so co-regulation is supposed to happen before self-regulation. That's the developmental trajectory. In order to co-regulate, we need safe, predictable, regulated others in our world. If that doesn't happen, then instead of co-regulating, we self-regulate out of a survival need. And so we learn how to survive on our own. And yet the need for co-regulation never goes away. But what happens, because the nervous system is such a brilliant and creative survival system, it creates patterns of protection instead of the patterns of connection that would have been built, because they're not available. A caregiver is either dangerous to us, which happens, a fair amount, or is unpredictably available, right? Which is up to the nervous system trauma as well, right? Steve once said trauma is a chronic disruption of connection. And if we had the nervous system, if the nervous system was going to tell us what is trauma, I think that's what it would say. It's having this disruption in the ability to feel safely connected. Right? And so in our childhood experience, when we don't have safe co-regulating others, we then, default to self-regulation. Only it's self-regulation from survival, not from safety. And so it then begins to impact us. Right? We have a lot of sympathetic need, drivenness on board. I self-regulate from that driven place, right? So that I'm seeking, but I'm never satisfied. That's a sympathetic driving experience, right? And so I'm always looking, I'm always trying, because I know there's no one else to help me with this, right? Or I end up in that dorsal sort of dulled, unaware, disconnected place, because that's the survival energy that's going to make me, I'm going to make it through with that energy. And so many people go through the world that way. They're just not quite there, sort of in that dulled experience place, right? And either one of those, you can feel the suffering, can't you, as we're just talking about it? And either one of those, the nervous system is doing an adaptive survival response. Right? It's bringing that adaptive survival response with the hope that someday ventral regulation and co-regulation can happen. That's my belief, that the nervous system longs for that and inherently will reach for that and know how to get there when there is safety around.
Which is very absent for a lot of children. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And adults as well. Yeah.
And we make meaning about that, don't we? If we think about kids in school, we assign motivation, make moral meaning about their behavior instead of looking and saying, oh, that's a nervous system that's dysregulated and is asking for help. It's a nervous system that needs support, right? We make some other story instead. And then as the child who's receiving that story, I begin to take it on and believe it, right? Oh, I must be. I've worked with so many people who come to me saying, I'm too much,
Mhm.
right? Because they had all this sympathetic, disorganized energy growing up and they kept being told to calm down. You're too much. You're too overwhelming. And so that's the story they now carry. Instead of the story is, wow, your sympathetic nervous system just, really had this big disorganized energy that other people didn't have a way to help you co-regulate.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that's kind of part of the origin too of children turning against themselves, feeling like there must be something. So there's two directions I want to go here, but just one little comment is that drivenness is the root of a lot of addiction. We
Yes.
need to escape from that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Again, if we talk about addiction, I like to look through the lens of the nervous system and what is the particular dysregulation that this nervous system is trying to communicate to me. And the addiction, the specific addiction, is the symptom of that dysregulation. And when we look at it that way, we begin to create a new story for our clients and even those of ourselves who suffer from these addictions, that oh, my nervous system is trying to help me regulate, right? So we talk about harm reduction, we talk about all these ways of working with it, because the nervous system is using that behavior in an attempt to find safety and regulation. So we can't just take it away without having something to replace it, right? I always tell my clients, this is a resource, right? Not one that you want to keep forever, but we can't take away resources unless there's some other resource to come in. You can't just leave a void, right? So yeah.
So coming back to children, one of the things that feels really hard for people is that feeling of powerlessness and that dorsal kind of, I can't handle this. There's nothing that I can do to help. So could you speak a little bit about coming out of that? So to circle back to the COVID issue, coming out of feeling powerless, which I think everybody does right now to some extent, into a fight response.
Yep.
What's the attraction there, and how can we work with that?
Yeah, it's so fascinating because sympathetic has a couple of different roles and responsibilities. The sympathetic nervous system. One is to protect us by fighting or fleeing, so that we can come back to ventral. But the other is to keep us out of dorsal, because dorsal is such a life-threatening place for we humans. It's a conservation mode. Everything begins to shut down. It's dorsal is a place where we disappear. I feel untethered to myself, to the world. It's truly a place of feeling not seen, not heard, not being, not existing. And so sympathetic tries really hard to keep us out of that place. And so for many of us, our sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive when it feels we're going to get pulled into dorsal. The other thing is, when we're in dorsal, sympathetic nervous system, the job is to help us get out of there, right? The problem being that when sympathetic activates to get us out of dorsal, it feels too big, too much, overwhelming, too scary. And we have a moment of coming out and often go back into dorsal. So this peek your head out, back to dorsal, peek your head out, back to dorsal. Or what I often find is as we begin to come out of dorsal and find that sympathetic, too much survival energy, that's where all of our really messy behaviors live, right? And so we end up back in those messy behaviors. That's where, we We start using again. We start, shopping online. We start binging. We start all of those behaviors because that sympathetic's way of trying to help us come out of dorsal. And so the practice really, as we begin to come out of dorsal, and in the beginning, coming out of dorsal is really something that takes another regulated nervous system to help us with. I've discovered that. Um, I will say, when I work with people, ventral I call our home, and so we're always trying to get back home. And then we have a home away from home in one of the survival states. My home away from home is dorsal. It's where I went as a kid. It's where I still go when the world is too much. And so I'm pretty good at now getting myself from dorsal through sympathetic back to ventral because I've been doing it for 68 years now, right? And so, but in the beginning, when we first learn, when we come out of dorsal, we need some energy. We need a controlled, contained amount of energy. We usually need another person who's regulated to help us do that, to be a guide for that. And in the beginning, the return of energy can be something as subtle as looking up and glancing at another person, or looking up and seeing, oh, there's a world outside my window, right? That's a beginning return of some energy. And we want to have a very gentle return of energy so that we can not get stuck in the survival energy of sympathetic, but we can feel the sympathetic mobilization and keep coming up into ventral. That's a challenge, and it's something that we work a lot on for those of us who find ourselves in dorsal often and have to climb back out. So that's a practice. Yeah.
Mm. And also with all of the fight flight energy right now, especially in the media, or even if you go to the store and someone's yelling about a mask, I'm not going to wear that mask or whatever it is, it's hard to manage the amount then of stimulation that we have.
Yes, and with all of this coming at us, we find ourselves in our survival home away from home frequently, right? And I will say, I would like to say that being anchored in ventral, being regulated all the time is not the goal. That's not the goal of well-being. That's an unachievable, unattainable goal, and we need our survival energy. It serves us well. The work to be flexible is to know, oh, I am being pulled into one of my survival states by what's going on here. And here are some ways that I can stay anchored enough in ventral so that I don't join the world in a survival state. That's what we're looking to do. And yes, think about the grocery store where, mask, no mask, whatever people are doing, distance not, and people get very fearful. Right. Fear is what's underneath any of these survival states. It's a neuroception of danger. Right. And then, they erupt into either sympathetic fight, flight, or dorsal freeze, or just, it's interesting. The dorsal going through the motions unaware then causes some of this because I'm not paying attention, because I'm not really here, right? So I'm bumping into you. I'm too close. I forget my mask or whatever. So that's a dorsal, experience. And the sympathetic is, I'm not going to wear my mask. You can't make me, that, and it comes from an underlying neuroception of danger, right? Or I'm going to be right there next to you in the line. I don't care, right? And if we can look and say, oh, that's a nervous system that is feeling endangered, sometimes we can have a bit of awareness, at least. Sometimes I can be a bit curious. And then sometimes I can even have some compassion, right? But I kind of go in that. I say, I want awareness first. Then I want a bit of curiosity. Wonder what's going on for that person. Sometimes the last of compassion. Oh, they are really suffering in some way. So yeah, but that is happening all the time for all of us now, in the world, in the news, in the newspaper. It's just, we're being bombarded by cues of danger, and we don't have the time to catch our breath, right? It's really difficult. Unpredictable is a cue of danger to most nervous systems. Unpredictable is not interesting. It's scary, right? And the world is unpredictable at the moment. Everything's unfamiliar. Another common cue of danger to the nervous system. So yes, it's just, we are suffering. And I think because it's been going on so long and we've had so many starts and stops and starts and stops, I think our nervous systems are just exhausted. Everything we do, you can't just do it routinely anymore. You have to think about everything you do. So it's exhausting, right?
It is, yeah. I had lunch with one of my grandchildren the other day, and it was socially distanced. We had to show that we'd been vaccinated. Everything was being taken care of. We had the masks, all that. And yet I was still looking around the room. And it wasn't a red alert. It was just kind of it doesn't
Yeah.
feel completely comfortable. And all
Yeah.
of those cues, even the socially distanced tables, the masks, those are also cues just to remind us it's not completely safe here.
Exactly. All of the things that are meant to create more safety don't necessarily bring a neuroception of safety, right? They may concretely make us safer. So you were safer because of all those precautions, and yet your neuroception was not one of safety. It's interesting, isn't it? And yet you also had enough awareness on board that you could notice, oh, there's a little bit of feeling unsafe, and I could still enjoy this lunch with my grandchild.
Right. Yes.
Mm.
So if we
Mhm.
go back to a more extreme case, I want to bring shame into this and how this works with the vagal system. So if we look at a child who's dysregulated, the dysregulation at the dorsal are not as hard to deal with. So probably those are just left to sit at their desks. But if you get a child who's in a fight response, then they're going to have trouble at school. They're going to be shamed. They're going to be told you're too sensitive, you're too out of control. And then they develop that real feeling of there's something wrong with me.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so how does that work with the ventral system?
Yeah. So it's interesting that I want to talk just a moment about the dorsal disappearing kids, because they're either seen as easy kids to have in the classroom because they don't say anything and don't demand anything, or seen as outcast misfits, right? And they are suffering so because nobody understands that they aren't really there, right? So yes, and so they get a different sense of shame, right? They don't get shamed by others, but they feel this internal sense of it's a true not fitting in any place, and there's a shame, different shame that comes along with that. So if we think about the sympathetically charged kids, the acting out kids, who the kids who are, they end up in our offices for therapy because somebody sees them. Even though they make a motivational moral story about them, they at least get sent somewhere to help figure this out. But by the time they get to, therapy, they carry that shame story, right? And that shame story, is interesting because shame, I think, truly, is that sympathetic dorsal loop that happens, right? Shame, when we feel bad, toxic, unacceptable, it often takes us to the dorsal disconnect, collapse, don't be here place. And yet, the response to that is often a sympathetic fight, right? So that you've got that loop going on, and we get into that sympathetic place of I'm bad, right? Which is the belief that can take you to dorsal, and so sympathetic is going to make sure that doesn't happen. And so there's all of this acting out behavior, right, around the I'm bad. And in some ways, what our nervous system is simply doing what it needs to do for survival, and yet it's bringing the I'm bad story to life in the outside world, because others are just going to keep saying, see, you're still doing this. Why are you doing, calm down, right? Calm down is such a horrible thing to say to kids, right? Could, if I could, I would, right? First of all, that's the thing. And second of all, if you're thinking about the hierarchy, right, where it's ventral, sympathetic, dorsal, when I'm in sympathetic, somebody tells me to calm down, they're telling me to go to dorsal.
Mm.
Right? They're telling me to get rid of that sympathetic energy and just disconnect rather than let's calm up. Let's organize some of that sympathetic energy so that we can come to ventral and use the mobilizing energy in a way that makes sense. So, the kids with shame, have that awful, sort of problem going on where shame is going to take them to dorsal. And so I'm going to stay in sympathetic and I'm going to act out in these ways to make sure, that I do bad things, but I don't go to where I'm bad. So it's an interesting, complicated process to tease apart. And the first thing you have to do is you have to show up with a regulated, nervous system that sends a neuroception of safety to a highly dysregulated kid. And that's hard to do.
Very
Right?
hard because they trigger
Yeah,
us all the time. Activating.
absolutely.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And so again, that's where being able to look through the eyes of the nervous system and see dysregulation instead of see, someone who's bad or someone who's, I know parents, and teachers, would say they're just doing it because they want to. They could stop if they wanted to. That's often the story we hear. And it's like, wow, yep. So the first place we work is with the adults,
Mhm.
right? Got to
Yeah.
work with the adults first because they have to change the way they're looking and the cues they're sending to that dysregulated kid.
When we're looking in a family setting, oftentimes, I mean, I've been around children who are hard to stay regulated around. And so if the adult is perceiving the child as a threat, then how could they work with that? So it's my child, I should be the adult, I should be the co-regulator. But in
Right,
fact, I feel really
right,
dysregulated from that.
right, exactly. And that does happen, and it happens in those really challenging ways. It also happens, when parents who are fairly good at co-regulating, are their resilience is down. If we take a less extreme, it's like, I'm here, with my daughter and son-in-law and grandkids, and I notice it. It's like, yeah, they've had a really long, difficult day, and kid has had a really long, difficult day, and that's a recipe for, well, yeah, the grown-up's got to be the one that brings the regulation, but not don't have the resilience to do that right now. It's not that I'm feeling threatened by my child, but I just can't show up for my child, which is why it's lovely to be a grandma. And I can do that tonight, right? I can help there, right? But for the more extreme experiences that happen fairly commonly as well, when we feel threatened by, our nervous system brings a neuroception of danger, right, of true danger I can't co-regulate with that child. We need to recognize that, and we need to have an option, because nothing good can come of that, right? If I'm acting from a survival state, then my child, I cannot be a co-regulator for my child, and my child is simply going to get more extreme in their responses, right? So we need to have, who do I call? What do I do? How do I get another nervous system to connect with, even if it's just connecting with me, to help me find a moment of regulation so I can then deliver that to my child? I need another nervous system to remind me I'm okay, right? When I'm in ventral, I do have skills. I do have options. I do have things I can reach for. But when I leave ventral, I leave the capacity to connect with that behind, right? Not because I want to, but my biology then closes off the pathways to understanding that. It closes the pathway to my prefrontal cortex, actually, right? And so I've lost all of that ability. So my first job, if I know I've gone to a survival state, is I have to get myself back to ventral, right? I have to make sure my child is safe, physically safe, but I cannot connect from a place where I can bring emotional regulation because I'm not there, you know?
Right. And that's really a tough situation for so many people right now, especially. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. We've disconnected people from their social support networks,
Mhm.
right? We have, think a minute, we have social support and we have social connection. And I think about those differently. Social support are the people who provide services that are much needed in our lives, childcare, help with house, help with transportation, all those things. And we've lost, in-home support. We've lost that capacity to have that during COVID. So social support is limited, and then social connection, which are the people who show up in our lives when we call at 3 a.m. we can count on, right? That has been changed as well, because it's different to talk to somebody on the phone and say, help, I just can't find my way to regulation, and they can't just come over, right? It's let me help talk you through it. It's like, ooh, yeah. So social support and social connection have been impacted during this time, still are impacted, and we see the results of that. We see the increase in family struggles, in what's happening in family systems.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I thought was very interesting, and I loved the course you did with Sounds True, Befriending Ourselves. It's an amazing course. I'd highly recommend it for people. One of
Thank
the
you.
things you said in there was we lose our capacity for compassion when we're not in ventral.
Yes. Yeah.
And that inner critic, so that self-criticism automatically comes when we're in sympathetic or dorsal. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Yeah, compassion is, we have what we call emergent properties. That means this is what our nervous system gives us access to when we're in a certain state. And in ventral, compassion is an emergent property of ventral. We can see the world through the eyes of compassion, right? I could look at you and say, oh, you are so dysregulated, right? And then the next step, because compassion I think of as empathy in action, so that I can feel you're dysregulated, and then I can offer. Right. So it's not just I'm feeling it, because that's one thing, but then I can offer, and the question I always ask is, what does your nervous system need in this moment? That's my question, right? The first question is, what does my nervous system need to get to ventral and anchor there? But then what does that nervous system need in this moment? Right. And that sort of leads the process of where I would go next, whether it's a friend or a client or a colleague, doesn't matter. It's what does the nervous system need? Because it's trying to communicate with me. It's telling me something, right? What does it need? So that's compassion. And when we leave ventral, we leave the biological ability for compassion. And we go to sympathetic. Sympathetic is a place where our inner critics live, right? Because we feel endangered in some way. We feel judged. We feel, looked at in a way that's not accepting of who we are, right? And that's in this sympathetic place. So my inner critic just comes to life, trying to say, trying to help me get out of there. Not helpful usually, right? But the intention is to help me, right? Again, if we think about the biological intention of a survival state, it's to help you survive. So my inner critic that says, you are so stupid, you needed to do this or do this, all of the shoulds, whenever we hear should, we know we're not in ventral. Should is not a ventral word, right? Should is a sympathetic. You should, you need, you have to. Those are sympathetically charged words. And then in dorsal, again, as a rescue from all of the ways the world is too demanding, kind of just not really there to, my inner critic kind of goes away because I go away. It's a very different experience there. It's sort of, well, the world is dark and I'm floating, something like that. Those are the two questions that I ask people all the time in each state. The world is and I am, because those beliefs change so much when we move between states. And it's an interesting way to think, oh, so in sympathetic, the world is chaotic, disorganized, dangerous, and I am at the mercy of all of these outside forces, right? I can feel it in myself, and then in ventral, the world is filled with possibilities, and I'm okay to explore, right? You can feel the difference. And the difference is not my brain doing it, it's my biology. Because the body's job, the nervous system sends the information to the brain. And then the brain's job is to make a story that makes sense of what's going on in our body. And you can hear the different stories, right? In sympathetic, the stories are ones of being surrounded by dangerous people in a dangerous world, right? There's that going on. And dorsal, the stories are filled with some sort of despair. It's only in ventral that the stories bring possibility and hope. So, yeah. So, really, when we're working with ourselves or with others, the goal is to bring enough ventral back so that we can begin to see those stories of possibility. And then from ventral, we can visit the survival stories that live in sympathetic and dorsal. And we can be informed by them. We can be with them, not hijacked by them, right?
And there's a lot of the somatic mindfulness based therapies or practices now are really working with that. How can we stay grounded in safety in the present moment? And then
Right.
from there, develop that connection with our child at that age or whatever that might be.
Right, right. And that's really, honoring the fact that ventral regulation is the essential ingredient for doing this work, right? I mean, lots of models of therapy, and whatever model of therapy you're practicing, you are engaging with your client's nervous system. Whenever I am exploring something, I'm engaging with my nervous system. And so understanding how to bring enough of that ventral anchoring energy so that I can safely explore is the key to understanding how I can begin to revisit some of those early moments that were so traumatic and will be traumatic again if I just go back to the moment. You get pulled back into the survival energy of that moment, right? Because the nervous system brings it alive again, and it feels like I'm reliving it, right? Not remembering it, I'm reliving it. It's only from ventral that we can remember. Right. So again, I often talk to my clients, I'll say, we're going on an autonomic journey. I don't know where we're going because we're going to go where the nervous system wants us to go, but we're taking ventral with us. So it's okay. Right. As long as you take enough ventral, we're going to be okay. Yeah.
And that's probably why we're more regulated if we're with someone else who's regulated. And so if you're a therapist or a friend or your parent or whoever it is regulated, then it's so much easier for us.
Yes. And for many people, the first co regulating mammal is a pet. Right.
Mhm.
Because pets, are that lovely, nervous system experience of just being loved and welcomed and with, right? And so in my early work, for many of my clients, that first co-regulating safe experience was their pet. It's lovely. It's lovely. So, and so many of us have pets. And certainly through the pandemic, many people brought pets into their world, right? And it's a co-regulating mammalian nervous system. So it's fascinating how a pet can be that first experience. We also co-regulate with nature. It's just that it's a different experience because yes, it is living, breathing, alive, but it's different than this mammalian system. But for some people, a sense of being safely held in nature may be the first place they go as well, right?
That's certainly one of my places. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So for someone who has a very dysregulated nervous system, who's not in ventral very often, who's often triggered into things, how might they? Two questions. One is, do you believe that we can actually heal enough to be safe enough in another's arms, as Steve Porges says? Do you believe that's the truth, that everybody can heal?
I do. And I think we have some interesting research that shows how the nervous system can be reshaped, and we can have both more ventral tone in our system, is what we call it, so that I have more access to my ventral energy, and I can learn how to come back from dysregulation more quickly,
Mhm.
to not go there so intensely, and to maintain a bit longer in ventral. Those are all ways we reshape the nervous system. And we do that by doing small things over and over. There's not a big thing we do to make that shift. The nervous system is shaped in micro moments. And so for people who, really suffer with that system that dysregulates easily and often, right? What we want to do is we want to find something that gives you a micro moment. I call them glimmers, gives you a glimmer moment of ventral, and then do that. over time, and then look for another one and add that. So it's not that we have to do some great big thing or make some great big change. And I think that's really reassuring. I know that was reassuring to my nervous system. Oh, I can do that. I can find this one thing. And like you, nature is often where I go. So I can head to the beach and take a walk and know that this is reshaping my nervous system. How cool is that? Or I can find the music that really brings me a moment of joy. It's reshaping my nervous system, right? So as we find something that brings a spark of ventral energy, of that sense of okayness or happiness or organization, however you're going to describe the flavors of your ventral, and then find something that brings a spark of that and begin to write those things down, and then begin to turn to that and do 2 or 3 of those a day, right? Like, turn on your favorite piece of music once a day. Or I live part of the time in Maine by the beach. So the beach is my place. It's my soul home. And I am now in Chicagoland, nowhere near a beach, and yet I'm near grandkids. So there's the trade-off. But I bring beach stones with me because I love beach stones. And so I have a specific beach stone. It's a heart-shaped beach stone. And I remember who I collected it with and where I got it. And it's a ventral, experience to me to just hold it. Right. And that's easy for me to do. Right. And so sometimes I'll pick it up when I'm feeling a bit distressed oh, I need a little of this energy. And sometimes I just have it around and see it. It's shaping my nervous system. These small things we do shape our nervous system, right? If you have a friend, who you really feel, oh, when I'm with that person or when I'm around that person or think of that person, it brings me that sense of welcome, right? Find a way to have a connection once a week, not every day, once a week. Send an email, do a FaceTime, whatever it is, what works for your nervous system, but give yourself permission to do small things over and over.
I love that. And with addiction, when we're looking at, I'm usually stuck in dorsal, so I'm going to need something stimulating to bring myself up, or I'm feeling really sympathetically dysregulated, so I need something to bring me down. And to look at those, and some of those patterns and grooves are decades old. So to not say, well, I'm going to quit doing that right now, we might be more mindful of like you said, I don't want to let this pattern last forever. But just to introduce more resources, and then we're not going to need the addictive behavior or the substance as much.
Right. And I love how you say, that they've been ingrained in our system for a good reason for decades. Right. And so if we can first, one of the things that I like to do, with my clients and even with my own experiences is to notice, oh, survival response. And to just spend a moment sending a bit of gratitude for what kept me alive. And then that second part, maybe don't need it all the time going forward, or something like that. You'll create your own words, but to recognize, yep, got me alive here today. And now I can begin to shape it in a new way so it doesn't have to activate so intensely so often, right? But to recognize and honor, the way it has served me. And even doing that, if you can simply do that and go, oh, survival response, that's a moment of ventral. That's a drop of ventral. So you've already started to shape it differently, to not just enter into that pattern, but to recognize the pattern begins to shape it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very powerful. Yeah. Gosh, I feel like we could talk for 3 hours, but I'm aware that we're getting close to the end of our time. So, do you want to just say a little bit about your books, your programs, how people can get a hold of you, your website? How can people get in touch?
Sure. Yeah, rhythmofregulation.com is my website. And I came upon that years ago and have loved rhythm of regulation. It just feels like what we're trying to bring to our systems and then offer to others. So rhythmofregulation.com. I love that you mentioned befriending your nervous system, the Sounds True audio, because that really is less clinical and more general audience. And I love that. And my first print book with them is coming out actually next week, and it's called Anchored. And again, it's exercises for everyday people, which is really part of what my passion is. Everybody understanding the nervous system. My clinical work, polyvagal theory and therapy, engaging the rhythm of regulation, and then polyvagal exercises for safety and connection. So, a bunch of different ways you can connect. But if you come to the website, there are a lot of free resources, podcasts, things you can listen to just to kind of get more curious and explore, right? What's happening inside this body that's taking me through the world, right? And has done it in a brilliant way, right? And, might if I could partner with my nervous system, we might be able to do it differently moving forward.
Right, right. That's a wonderful thing to know, that we have a nervous system. It works a certain way. We're not bad or defective because we have a nervous system, and to go from there.
Yeah, and I like to think the nervous system is the common denominator, in across humanity. We all have one, right? And so if we can remember that, and they're organized along those three organizing principles, in response to our life experience to try and keep us alive and safe, it kind of brings us all together. It takes away the differences and honors the way that, wow, we all have this nervous system that's really working hard.
Well, thank you so much for being here and being on the summit. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your wisdom and the co-regulating hour that we spent together.
It was lovely, wasn't it? I agree. Co-regulation at work. Beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Deb. This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. We have an exciting lineup for our 5th annual, including Dr. Gabor Maté as our keynote speaker. Head on over to radicalrecoverysummit.com to learn more and watch the interviews.